TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. A treaty behind closed doors affecting 194 countries, and most of us citizens are unaware. The final ratification of the WHO World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty set to be voted on May 24. It would give power to an unelected body of officials over things that affect human freedom, our health, the ability to move, vaccination requirements, emergency declarations, climate change measures, and so much more. There are some who say it would make the world a, quote, safer place. And I say to that a little bit, take it with a grain of salt and caution, because every time when someone says it would make the world a safer place, it's an illusion. So what's actually happening? The intergovernmental negotiating body, which is tasked under the WHO to draw up an instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and worldwide response, is ratifying the final text on May 24 at the World Health Assembly. It's kind of a one-world governance approach through the back door, with wide-reaching consequences for nations, thus all of us. Ever since COVID, we learned that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work. So the pandemic treaty by the World Health Organization and why you should be on alert is our topic tonight. Good evening and welcome on Smart Sustainability, the show with a wholesome approach on creating a sustainable future going forward. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Thanks for joining us. The WHO Pandemic Treaty is an important document, no question. It may have good intentions or not, but what it does under any circumstance is trying to centralize power under the radar, and there's not much we hear about in our media, newspaper, print, whatever. Like, who's backing it? Who's funding it? What are its main interests? And who actually is the WHO? Who runs it? Things we should know, and then conclude what it is we really want to do. Now, the WHO under COVID showed how dangerous and ineffective it can be to outsource our response power to an external organ. In many countries, citizens are mobilizing to stop the treaty. Africa and Asia are taking the lead in these movements for good reason. Countries who do not obey the technocrat-led WHO in their pandemic responses can get sanctioned and penalized for non-compliance if the treaty goes forward. Now, for the United States as a bigger nation, that may seem less a reality, so to speak, but for smaller countries, it's a big deal. And depending on who we have in our government come November, it's big for us in the United States as well. Few are aware of this impending treaty because mainstream media doesn't report on it. And because we're here in the United States get bombarded and blindsided with coverage on Trump trials. So we're diving into this upcoming treaty in the next hour, what that means, how it would impact nations and its citizens, how it impacts us, and what could be perhaps a better alternative in managing and answering to pandemics of global scale or global outbreaks in a coordinated way that doesn't impede on our freedom. My guests tonight are an impressive lineup from the World Council for Health, a nonprofit organization initiative for the people that is informed and funded by the people. See the difference? It's a global coalition of health-focused initiatives and civil society groups that aim to pioneer a better way to safeguard our health and freedom. So joining us from Japan, Izumi Kamichu from the World Council for Health Steering Committee in Japan. We have Australian lawyer Ashby Koppens from South Africa, Fahrie Hassan. He's a molecular biologist, journalist, and expert on conflict of interest, corruption, WHO Influenza Guideline Committee, as well as the WHO funding. We want to start playing a video as to what the WHO actually is and why it should be on everyone's radar.
The World Health Organization is the institution granted exclusive power to guide and protect the health and wellness of humanity. The WHO is sustained by private donations the bulk of which are made by pharmaceutical and biotech corporations who have a vested financial interest in the organization's support. Tedros Ghebreyesus is the World Health Organization's first Director General that isn't a medical doctor. The appointment to the organization's highest position was controversial, given that in his previous role as Ethiopia's health minister, Tedros was accused of covering up 3 major health epidemics.
Tedros is no stranger to controversy. As a former Minister of Health in Ethiopia, he has been accused of an alleged cover-up of 3 possible cholera epidemics.
Prior to his appointment, Tedros was a high-ranking member of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, a brutal and corrupt political group responsible for crimes against humanity, including bombings, kidnappings, tortures, and killings. How does a man with such a controversial past score the top position at the world's most influential health organization?
I have known Bill and Melinda for many, many years now. We will have many body bags in front of us if we don't behave.
If one analyses how the WHO is funded, one sees that organizations like the Gates Foundation are significant supporters, and so he who pays the piper calls the tune. I think that's a good starting point in looking at these things.
Without our consent, in May 2024, the World Health Organization, via member state delegates, will exercise a power grab over our health, freedom and sovereignty.
This is 3 months from now at the next World Health Assembly by WHO's 194 member states. This process takes place behind closed doors and at a tremendous speed. It is not reported nor discussed in our newspapers, in our national parliaments, in universities, nor in society.
There's going to be a very important vote, and Uganda, being a member of the World Health Organization, is supposed to be informed before this vote. But as far as I know, none of this has been brought to the attention of Parliament yet, and yet we have less than a month to go into this vote.
Both of these documents, what they do is they create a new supranational body that gives the WHO legally binding global authority over public health emergencies of international concern.
This is actually worse than what happened in COVID, because they don't even have a standard that says they have to isolate a pathogen. They don't have to isolate anything. What they have to do is simply say, we think that there is a reason to declare an emergency, and as such, we therefore have the ability to suspend travel, to actually penalize member states. There's a very big clause inside of the treaty that actually has penalties on member states for non-compliance.
All the countries have been...
Wait. So hold on, I'm interrupting you, but I just want to... The WHO will override, let's say, my country's decision on how to handle the next pandemic.
Right, exactly. He can just declare it with no standards, and then countries around the world will have to obey.
The most worrying for me is actually Article 12, which says that in the event of a potential or actual health emergency, so this doesn't just relate to pandemics, this is any health emergency, and that could be anything, that the Director General shall determine on the basis of information received, and that can be secretive information, it doesn't have to be declared. The Director General, this one individual who there is a lot of concern about his history and experience, that he should have this power, and then each country gets 48 hours.
48 hours to respond or explain or face the consequences, including sanctions.
Do you think it's going to have an equal sort of footing with all nations, or will there be a difference in how nations are treated by the WHO?
So that's, of course, a really good question. If you're asking a country that doesn't have the resources to come back to you within 48 hours and then they don't, not only do you malign them to the emergency committee, but you say, you know what, maybe we should look at sanctions against this country. And maybe this country has got resources like oil and diamonds. Wouldn't that just be very convenient?
WHO will be authorized to issue recommendations with legally binding effects.
You know, when you take out the words not binding as an amendment, it then becomes binding. You know, these are binding treaties. If we do nothing, these treaties are binding. They're legally binding across all the nations.
This is legislation. This is legislation directly affecting every human being. We are talking about
compulsory vaccination, lockdowns, closures of borders and businesses, and worst of all, detention of anyone not complying with the latest vaccine mandate and forced medical procedures.
This will come under the title and concept of One Health. So whether to fight a human influenza with a new subtype, or to reduce rising level of CO2, or to respond to the loss of biodiversity, or to fight climate change, all of that can give rise to the next pandemic.
They will be able to impose a climate lockdown. That's the next step. That's what we're talking about.
We see all these kind of authoritarian measures being adopted in the name of saving the planet.
It's global governance.
It's the tyranny, organized tyranny under velvet and a golden cage. You know, it's
a form of global governance, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is a centralized global government, but we didn't know how they were going to do it, and they're using health in all policies to create this global governance.
Towards a one world government seeking to erode the sovereignty of independent nations.
There would be amendments to implement an international global health certification system, enabling nations to enforce travel restrictions using tools such as vaccine certificates, passenger locator forms and traveller health declarations, all tied potentially to a personal QR code.
And then mass surveillance of compliance via digital certificates. So we all have to have digital certificates, and in that way they will check whether we're all doing what we're told.
They could lead to draconian measures undermining our national interests if accepted.
Which means what?
It means that when there is a national health security threat, you can take over the country with the army. So you imagine this at the global level?
Right.
So if they get the global commands, and there is...
So it's martial law.
It's martial law.
And the title of this session, are we ready for a new world order?
We have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
When you really take all of this together, there is no other way for me to actually say this. It will be a complete impoverishment and enslavement of all the people.
People have to understand it's all about control. So being aware of the globalist end game in all of this, namely the implementation of a global governing system to control us, it seems to me that the powers that be will attempt to launch major crises, plural, on several fronts to facilitate this push into their new world order.
我々は WCH グローバル全体主義パンデミック条約と改定 IHR 遺伝子ワクチンプランデミック情報統制これら全てを排除することを宣言する3発目の原爆は我々国民の手で日本人の手で阻止しようではありませんか
Withdrawn from WHO.
My view is get out of the WHO.
Conclusion, defenders of freedom on both sides of the Atlantic need to stop these amendments from coming into pass. And call on all political parties and South Africans to reject the WHO's power grab under the guise of pandemic preparedness.
Can I just get a quick vote from everybody here right now? Who thinks we need to defund and exit from the WHO? That's a full house. The people have voted. Thank you very much.
So let's talk about the WHO treaty. What is it actually about?
First thing is still in draft, and we don't exactly know what our countries are going to be asked to be voting on next week or the week after, on the 27th of May. So we've got a pandemic agreement or treaty or instrument. It's been given a raft of different names. It does a lot of different things, all in the name of being pandemic prepared and ready. It requires, for example, so it's not a pandemic treaty per se. It's more like an agreement, an arrangement. So there are things about censorship, controlling research and development so that the messaging is controlled. Then separately, there is the requirement for countries to scour their countrysides for pandemic potential pathogens, which the WHO will then store in their own laboratories. There is a requirement for countries to enter into arrangements with pandemic medical products where they are to indemnify those companies or manufacturers from any liability, including compensation for any injury to those that have been hurt by these products. It's really, the pandemic agreement is really a large structure of new arrangements, I would guess. And those arrangements are going to be run by who knows what, who's going to have a say in it, we don't know. But those pandemic-related product companies have effectively an involvement. 100-day vaccines is on the radar, and there is a raft of other issues that people should be particularly alarmed about. But that's not just the only thing. Alongside the pandemic treaty or agreement, we've got another significant amount of amendments that are being done to our international health regulations, which are already legally binding on almost 194 states in full. So those amendments to the international health regulations are also significant. They're being done in parallel by the working group. Together, these documents create they'll make the last 4 years look tame, but they're also being drafted under the guise, I guess, of darkness, but certainly behind closed doors. We only just received the latest version of those amendments in April. Again, they've been working on them last week as well. So we've got the situation where both working groups or international negotiating bodies continue to work on these documents. We don't have a final version. Goodness knows what we're to be voting on in a couple of weeks' time. But the issue is we were supposed to have these documents in January this year for the regulation amendments, and by the end of March this year for the pandemic treaty. So we're all going into this situation where we're going to be asked to vote, and we don't know, and we haven't had a chance to consider what we will be voting on.
Yeah.
The other issue with that is a positive vote indicates probably a desire to be bound, and that's just not on. We can't have that. These negotiations have continued. We need to postpone voting, or countries have to reject them because they've had no time to consider them.
But actually, let me follow up on something. So how legally binding can actually an agreement be between a number of states, in this case 194 states? How do we envision legally binding, outsourcing it to basically an external body that's somewhere in a different country? What's going to happen if a country says, well, we signed today? In our case, let's say Trump gets in office in November, that would be the first thing he would say, we're out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he'll be able to, potentially. Legally binding means legally binding at the international level. But there's such powerful language within the documents that there's a requirement for countries to quickly implement what is required at the international level into the domestic level. So legally binding internationally means that there's only, I think, one organisation that can ensure that countries follow it, but effectively the geopolitical pressure and any other pressures for countries not jumping on board and agreeing and complying will be huge. It affects everything. Funding, access to medical products that aren't even related to pandemics, you name it, anything that can happen, there will be a pressure and a squeeze that will be put on countries for failing to comply with those legal, internationally legally binding requirements.
Now, Fahrie, you're in South Africa. You looked intensively into this issue as a whole. What do you see at stake for countries if they sign it?
If you allow me just to make reference to what Katie was saying, because I think one of the things that is very important for people to know is that one of the aspects of the pandemic treaty is that what will happen is that under the leadership of the Director General of the World Health Organization, the declaration of a pandemic will be solely in his, that's my understanding of it, Katie, just correct me if I'm wrong. It will be solely in his purvey to declare, at the moment, I understand that the countries, once a pandemic is, a virus or any pathogen is found to be present in many countries, then countries can come together and a scientific working group will come and decide whether this is an accepted risk to the global population. But under the present pandemic treaty, my understanding is that the Director General will have the power alone to make this decision of a pandemic. And that, to have that power within an unelected individual, that is very dangerous for national governments. And then Katie also mentioned about the international health regulations. Now, these amendments, while it is in 2005 it was agreed to and it was accepted, one of the problems with the amendments that is being suggested is the fact that sovereignty of governments to have their national health regulations overridden by an international body. For instance, let's call, earlier you mentioned about vaccines. The fact that when a pandemic is declared under the international health regulations, my understanding is that it can be declared that a particular vaccine is to be used. And the national, my understanding is that the national government, like say South Africa, for instance, will therefore, because they are signatory to this and after it has been accepted, they won't have the right to say no.
So they cannot refuse it.
They cannot refuse. This is dangerous, for us as our countries has been elected. The politicians have been elected by us in order to safeguard our borders. Mm-hmm. And now this is overridden by an international body. No, this is very dangerous.
Yeah. Now, that brings up, though, one really important question. And I have a feeling that's probably why countries would be inclined to sign this deal in the first place. Because I believe there is a tendency in general when politicians nowadays are overwhelmed with a lot of these new developments that, we go into territories that we've never been before. So a lot of politicians like to hide behind an organization in terms of saying, well, the WHO told us so, hence we have less responsibility for whatever choice we make and for how many dead people would come out of it as a result of it or doesn't, and so on. So what I'm getting to is kind of like similar as in organizations where sometimes in most cases, they like to hire external consultants because it's easier to blame someone if things go wrong. I wonder if there's the same dynamics at play. What do you think?
I would say that pressure is being put on those governments to go along with this. It's like economic pressure and also geopolitical pressures. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, for small countries, very significant. However, for instance, Slovakia announced that they are not going to sign the treaty and the amendments.
So what happens actually, Fahrie or Katie, one of the two of you, what actually happens to those countries that say they're not going to sign? Are they then separate, and can this still go ahead with those that agree? Or what are we having then? Are we having then two kind of classes of, we have a dimension of free countries and a dimension of unfree countries? Like, how do we envision that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the situation is most of 194 member states have already agreed to the 2005 version of the International Health Regulations. If a country, or if the 2024 version does get up, a country has time to reject certain of those amendments that have been proposed. But they could then still be bound by the 2005 International Health Regulations. The Pandemic Treaty is an entirely new document, and that needs to get up on a 2/3 majority vote. And again, there's timeframes that will start running, but I think it is, if once 40 countries have signed it, that then becomes legally binding, and then there's timeframes for countries to get out of it. It's going to be an absolute mess. And the situation is that what they call for under these documents is equity and fairness amongst the states. But the countries are going to be put into a complete state of flux, especially if they're required to vote in May, because they won't be able to fully consider the ramifications under both documents on their countries, specific to what their needs and requirements are. The issue with treating health as one global organism is the fact that it doesn't take into any consideration the health, age, life, financial security of countries, and it's just going to make it so hard for countries to decide how these documents are going to specifically relate to them when it's just a one world order.
Yeah, and we've seen actually, particularly during COVID, I believe we've seen that it's of highest importance to actually make decisions on a local level, because circumstances are different, people are different, environments are different, so nobody can really say a one-size-fits-all approach to anything. I think this is really the big power shift that we're seeing between this approach of centralizing everything and decentralizing everything, and still have the collaboration that we need to really tackle these issues. I think that's a big one. Let's talk for a moment on a little bit background information on the World Health Organization. So for most of our viewers, I think most people really, other than having heard it's the World Health Organization, they know very little about it. So who is actually the WHO? Who are the funders? Let's start with that.
What my research have revealed, it's the World Health Organization basically gets their funding from two sources, two different contributions, right? So you get assessed contributions and you get voluntary contributions. Assessed contributions, it's quite broad, but I'll try to refine it. Assessed contributions mainly is comes mainly from countries, right? And the manner in which the World Health Organization can utilize this funds, assessed contributions can be used by the World Health Organization in whichever way it sees fit. So there's no restrictions on the use of such funding. Whereas voluntary contributions is quite different, and this is where the caveat is in how we see the World Health Organization, in my opinion. When you that's, it's always a case of follow the money, then you'll see where you end up and so on. The truth of the matter, so to speak. So voluntary contributions, on the other hand, is, of course, exactly what it means, voluntary, right? In a sense that the contributors, they have full say in how the money is spent, on what the money is spent, and in where the money is spent. And this is critical to understand, because 80% of the funding of the World Health Organization is voluntary contributions. And guess what? One organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, out of the 80% of the voluntary contributions, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, 40% of voluntary contributions comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That's an immense amount of power. So if you take, I think it was when I last checked the 2023 budget, it was around about 6 to 7 billion annual budget. If the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation contribution amounts to anything about 2 to 3 billion, that's a huge amount of control that it has.
The new one, new budget report issued by WHO from 2023, and the number one is United States of America, then comes Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Third is Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance.
Correct.
And then comes Germany.
Now, if you take that into account, the fact that Gavi, in fact, over the last several years, the total amount of money that was given to Gavi by the Bill and Melinda Gates stands at about $3 to $4 billion.
Okay, hang on a second. You have to clarify to our viewers, please, what Gavi is. Who's in it? What is it?
Clarify. So this is the Global Alliance of Vaccine Immunization. It is the body that was established ostensibly by governments, but the largest contribution to Gavi in terms of funding comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In fact, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has got a permanent board member on Gavi. So if you take Gavi and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as two of the biggest funders to the World Health Organization, it makes that two entities the biggest. So basically what I'm trying to say is I am putting forth the suggestion that they are basically determining policy for the World Health Organization. And earlier, Nicolette, you mentioned about you mentioned COVID-19 and the era. I don't know if people are aware that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has contributed funding to almost every COVID vaccine on the market. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has contributed funding, be it marketing, be it for the research, etc., to almost every COVID vaccine on the market, which means that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the beneficiary, direct profiteer and beneficiary from the COVID vaccines.
Okay, now just to play devil's advocate here for a second. Now there are some people who could say, okay, they're interested in vaccine and they want to help the humanity, if you want to say so, to basically vaccinate the world healthy. What's your response to that?
Well, you just have to listen to the Gates Foundation's own founder, in his response to this. Yeah. So when he was asked in an interview, I think it was a Fox interview at the time.
Gates Foundation has committed $650 million to fight COVID, which is the biggest contribution by any independent foundation. Where is that money going and what success have you had?
We have some very high-scale diagnostic things coming online. But the biggest area has been in the vaccine.
Because out of this investment, he accrued something like $200 billion out of it, right? I think that follow the money clearly tells you that it's had very little to do with saving the world. It was about making money, And clearly, now it's become quite clear if you study as I said, I'm a molecular biologist by profession, and I got into this whole COVID struggle because of my genetics background, and I didn't believe the PCR, because I'm a PCR specialist. I didn't believe that this was being used in a correct way. And secondly, when it came to the mRNA technology that was being used, clearly there was a lot of problems with initially with the trials that they had implemented. So that there already I started, the red flag started for me. And with the Gates Foundation being at the helm of this, I in fact originally many years ago I became an activist because I started working my research during my master's and PhD was doing on genetically modified organisms. And I realized back then the dangers of it. I then went into the field, activism, acting against it on GMOs. And what I discovered was that actually the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was the biggest driver of genetically modified technology in Africa, by Monsanto and Syngenta, and I realized when I saw that he was involved in the World Health Organization, I immediately took that knowledge from my past research that this cannot be a good thing for mankind.
Yeah, particularly given that you said that it's the number 2 funder? What was it? The number 2 funder, right? So first the United States said Izumi, then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then Gavi, and then Germany. Okay, I'm a native German. I will say this is, I'm quite shocked about that too. But apart from that, I want to talk a little bit about, bring Katie back on here on the vaccines, because Katie, you filed legislation against some of the vaccines, right, for some governments. How is this actually figuring into the WHO? Is this even being taken into account when there are, for example, filings against governments for vaccine issues?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. My experience with filing court cases in both New Zealand and Australia against the medicine regulators in both countries has seen pretty much a lockdown around the protection of those medical registers or registrars. Taking a slightly different tack in Australia recently, we actually went after Pfizer and Moderna. Under Australian legislation, their products clearly satisfy the definition of genetically modified organisms in Australia. And that was actually before the DNA contamination was discovered back February last year. So the LNP mRNA complex satisfies the definition of GMO in Australia. So we actually went after Pfizer and Moderna on the basis that both of their products were genetically modified organisms, and they failed to get the necessary license to deal with those products on Australian shores. AstraZeneca, for example, got a GMO license, but Pfizer and Moderna failed to. So taking a slightly different tack, we've gone actually after the pharmaceutical manufacturers now for those. And again, we're seeing failure in a separation of powers. We're seeing the judge produce a decision which goes to protect the pharmaceutical industry and protect our regulators. And the incredible thing is it turns out the judge actually was one of Pfizer's barristers for 4 decades of her career as a lawyer. So we've got these incredible situations happening. There is a very big Goliath protection and movement happening around all of the Goliaths. And we are seeing, now specified in the pandemic treaty, for example, 100-day vaccines, that is, vaccines produced within 100 days. No trials, just like we had no trials with the mRNA COVID-19 vaccines. And then also now countries will have to not just indemnify the pharmaceutical companies against loss, they will then have to then pay out the compensation for all those that have been left injured in their wake.
Unbelievable. Now, Izumi, hearing all of this, when we now know so much more insights into the vaccine side effects, into some of what really happened with the vaccines, etc., we know on the other hand there is the pandemic treaty of the WHO, and apparently those side effects and what all went wrong sounds like it's not that much discussed as sort of a lead up in how it should affect the treaty. People are mobilizing against that. What about Japan? Where is Japan coming in? It's always we've always been told in Asia people are so great in wearing masks, which I know they do because of pollution and other things. So where does this figure in this sort of, so we take a stronger stand against this treaty, and why is that the case?
I think the biggest danger of this treaty is that they can impose dangerous medical products on people, and this mRNA technology has never been approved before. It's already under development in the 90s, and have been in development over 3 decades or so. And then suddenly, due to the emergency authorization use, due to this pandemic declaration by WHO, it was all of a sudden it was possible to to use it to all peoples on the world. So it's incredible situation, and it's a kind of a takeover of hostile takeover of all the rules we have had before, all security and safety measurements for medical products has been abolished all of a sudden under the pretext of the emergency. This pandemics, and therefore, if WHO has if the WHO will have this power over us to declare pandemic and so-called public emergency of international health, international concern. It's PHEIC. It's a fake, Then we don't have any more freedom of choice and freedom of any kind of human rights, like freedom of speech, choice of medical treatment, also freedom of travel, and also the information will be restricted. So they are trying to control our mind with this. Many people are waking up about this imminent danger. It's more than, this is a danger, more dangerous than any kind of pandemic or so.
Yeah, particularly because it's gone under the radar. So is there at this point a resistance in Japan? Are people going on the street?
Yes, we have had a big rally in Tokyo and also many rallies in the other cities. On April, it was around April 13th. Mm-hmm. And we are going to have a big rally again on the 31st of May in the center of Tokyo, in the power center, the government center of Tokyo. We are going to have a live communication with other rallies in Europe, especially with Geneva on the 31st.
So when we look at this pandemic treaty, which is really a big treaty, and it seems it's a very big step for the world to even consider that at this point. When we look back at the background of the WHO, let me ask all three of you from your observations, when has the WHO actually effectively prevented anything?
Oh, well, that's a big one. If I could just step in there. The WHO, I think, when it was not receiving large amounts of private voluntary contributions and actually had experts at its helm rather than public health policy writers, which are just another public servant that have made their way up in these organisations, when that was actually an independent, properly independent, relying on full and proper experts, not just because somebody came from a particular country or was a particular religion, but actually had the expertise, then the WHO had a very good place in the world. The problem is that the WHO, through equitable employment or involvement standards, as a consequence of having people that have been public servants all their life with very little real life experience, that are really there just to, spout the messaging of COVID's taught us one thing: we're not safe. No one's safe until everyone's safe, and that's the environment that it is in now. It's heavily conflicted. It's got finances that are gifted or voluntarily contributed to it, that has links, and its credibility is undermined by its own greed. I think that the WHO has done some good things. certainly it has done some good things, but in the last 4 years, it's gone against many of its own recommendations. It insisted on much longer lockdowns. Children were excluded from school. All countries, I think, could clearly say they are in a worse state, having followed WHO recommendations over the last 4 years. Financially, countries are facing crippling costs and increased costs, but that's the current WHO. I do think that the WHO has done some good things. It's also done some really, really shocking things, and its rap sheet is very long for that.
So it really sounds like then it's really a question of governance, and since we really don't know how the governance is, then that kind of really puts it in jeopardy, so to speak.
It does, Nicolette, and the other thing is that we actually have no right of action against the WHO. They're a law unto themselves. And
so it's like it's not, because it's not even just a consulting function anymore. They want to move from an advisory function basically to an executive function, in sort of saying that we're going to decide what's going to happen from a technocrat-led point of view or standard.
Correct.
Yeah.
There were many good people before. I mean, our founder of WCH, Dr. Tess Lowry, was an external consultant of WHO and defining many important protocols for many diseases. And also other people like Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger, I think I pronounce her name correctly, and also Dr. Sylvia Behrendt, who was a lawyer and external consultant and also expert on IHR. They are all gone. They are not they are not involved in the WHO anymore since COVID started. So. The good elements, I mean, good people are leaving the board, and then the WHO is steering into something which is not
but I think
for the people.
I think it has a lot to do with the messaging, and Katie alluded to that. I think the messaging has changed considerably, so it comes across that it's not really about the health, but every time when somebody argues it's for your own safety and everybody has to be safe, you know who uses this kind of language. That is abusive, manipulative language that is usually used by dictatorials and dictators and autocrats for takeover. Those are the people who use the word safety.
If I may come in, then
yeah,
Nicolette,
come on, Fahrie.
I mean, I hear Zumi and Katie, and I mean, of course, as Zumi has indicated, very good people have been there. But I think at the time, a lot of these people were not aware of the track record of the World Health Organization. So I had an opportunity to research this. And what came out was actually, in my research, was actually very shocking to find out how we could have allowed this colossus to actually go on for so long. I mean, I'll give you, for instance, the famous tobacco scandal, So the World Health Organization came out very, supposedly anti-tobacco and smoking and so on. But when the guidelines were drawn up, what they did not make, what they didn't tell the people was that actually the entity that was part of the WHO guidelines on smoking received $250,000 from Philip Morris, and the individual was a consultant to the World Health Organization at the time, was a person by the name of Paul Dietrich. He was a tobacco lobbyist. And the list goes on, I mean, there's the old Purdue opioid analgesic scandal, which claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people all across the world. The World Health Organization drew up guidelines in 2011, for instance, right, saying that it's safe and effective. What they didn't tell the public was that the guidelines was influenced by Purdue and various of these pharmaceutical companies. In fact, Purdue wrote quite a bit of the guidelines, in fact, for the World Health Organization. And this is shocking to know that here you have and hundreds of thousands. I mean, in 2017 alone, something like 50,000 people died in America alone just from it. And they were actually saying, the World Health Organization actually came out and said that that was opioid phobia, a term that was quoted by that they included, the World Health Organization included in their writings, was actually coined by Purdue. So these are the things. Then there's a nuclear Chernobyl disaster. Up till today, on the website, you'll find that the World Health Organization has just 50 people died from the Chernobyl disaster. That occurred way back in the 80s. But a study, a New York Academy of Sciences study, which demonstrated that between the 1980s and 2004, I think it was, the study was, more than 1 million people, almost 1 million people had died. The World Health Organization went on a media frenzy, rubbishing the study, and by the way, also the scientists that was part of the study were threatened with their jobs and their persons by the World Health Organization. People didn't know this, but during investigations this came out. I can go on and on. There's a long list of, the 2004. I'll just then we can continue the conversation, because 2004. I'll give you an example. 2004, the pandemic preparedness guidelines was written down for influenza and for respiratory diseases was written down. Individuals that was part of the study was people like Professor Monton, Professor Albert Osterhausen, and more. But I'll just focus on those two. Professor Monton, for instance, who was part of the guidelines, he is on record. When I researched his papers and his institutes that he worked for and so on, he personally acknowledges that he received money from Merck, from Roche, from Sanofi. Would you believe that the World Health Organization never, in fact, acknowledged these conflicts of interest? But the beneficiaries of the guidelines were the same companies. Professor Osterhausen, for instance, who also wrote the academic preparedness plan guidelines, right? He's got an entity called the European Scientific Working Group, right? On the website, you can go on, the subtle there, even there today. For and this was during the H1N1, by the way, and that's another scam, the H1N1 supposed pandemic. Albert Osterhausen's institute that he works for received money from GlaxoSmithKline, Roche, Sanofi, the list goes on and on. All these entities were basically producing vaccines for H1N1. And he was the one that wrote the guidelines for it. I mean, this is clear conflicts of interest. The World Health Organization to suppress this. So what I'm trying to say is, I mean, I can speak for hours on this, my research. I mean, the list goes on in the criminality. It's criminality. When Margaret Chan announced the pandemic in 2009, that 2 billion people was going to die and so on, etc. The companies, Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, and all these have already started preparing the vaccines for the impending pandemic that's coming. So what happened? There was no pandemic. There was no epidemic. Very few people died. So what happened? They, in tandem with the World Health Organization, created a pandemic.
Which is kind of why it feels like with this pandemic treaty is like giving the fox the key to the hen house, if you want to say, looking at this conflict of interest, that if you really want to hand over the pharmaceutical companies the key to make a decision on who's going to get what vaccine, correct?
Exactly. So just lastly, this is a criminal entity. I know, when I looked at the entities that the World Health Organization has established under their realm, right? This is a vaccine business. Basically, they are, there's an entity called the International Vaccine Coalition, right? It's run by all the vaccine companies, basically, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and so on, etc. They are advising the World Health Organization, and guess what the World Health Organization said in 2009 with the H1N1 scandal? The media representatives said, look, we cannot do without the pharmaceutical industry. They are the ones that advises us on pandemics.
We have a few minutes left, so I want to shift gear here for the last few minutes and tackle what actually could be a better way to responding to a global pandemic. So yes, there is the thing of creating a pandemic, but pandemics can happen and do happen, and we all know that we do need sort of, in the interconnected world, there has to be sort of a cooperation to take a better approach. So Izumi, what could be a better way, for example, in handling a more coordinated response, but also allowing individual freedom?
First of all, we need to check if it's really a pandemic and if it's the measurements to be taken should be very carefully considered. And also, we have many possibilities to tackle those diseases. I mean, COVID was not that bad. I mean, in Japan, we had less mortality during the 2020. I mean, during the most severe pandemic, so-called pandemic, before the rollout of the vaccination. So people were doing fine. And there are many indigenous also like herbal medicines that can that are very effective against those infectious diseases.
Which were suppressed and partially forbidden.
Yeah, which were suppressed, like ivermectin and also other things.
Yeah. What does the World Council for Health envision as a better way of managing pandemics going forward?
The World Council for Health has a number of principles by which we operate called the Better Health Charter. There are 7 principles there which actually focus on people as an individual, and as treating technology in particular ways, and we all have agreed to abide by those because we consider that will make a better world. One of the questions you asked is what do we do for managing next pandemics? And look, there will be pandemics. The University of Leeds has just produced a report which actually says, given our technology and the ability to identify and our increase in sanitisation and things, the actually chance of naturally occurring pandemics is very low, yet there is a huge amount of effort being spent to get ready for the next pandemic, which the WHO gives you the impression that it is just around the corner. I think it's really important that we get the experts, the non-conflicted experts back to the table talking. I think it's important that dissenting voices are brought to the fray. I think it is, the chance that we get back to being able to talk about things that have been taboo or you've been silenced about. And that's really what the World Council for Health looks to do. It looks to bring all of the appropriate and suitable people into the room to allow countries to make decisions for themselves and for individuals to be able to make decisions for themselves.
So it's a lot about information. Thank you so much.
If I can just also add to that, Nicolette.
Yeah.
So one of the other things, I mean, Izumi already mentioned it, is indigenization. Indigenization. I mean, one of the things that was neglected in this and was in fact suppressed was first early treatment, right? Early treatment. The doctor, the frontline doctor, is the best individual to address this any pandemic, because he or she is the one that sees the symptoms and deals with it immediately. And so and the other thing, that one of the principles of the Better Way Charter is also to allow indigenous knowledge and indigenous medicine to be used in this regard. I think that is why Africa was so unaffected by this and at the lowest incidence of COVID. I think I want to
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I actually think that that part needs to find its way back into the overall medical field and just in general in the health field overall, because I think that's probably that holds the biggest potential. Thank you so much, all three of you, for coming on. We're out of time. This is it for the episode. So we had Japan, we had Australia, we had South Africa. Thanks all three for coming on. And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching. I do hope you heard about the WHO treaty and you actually are vigilant and write to your congressman and do something about this. Get more information. It is out there, sometimes in unexpected places, but it is important that you inform yourself, and most of all also let your congressperson know that you disapprove of this whole thing, because really we need to make the decisions by ourselves. And if COVID taught us anything, then it's that. So on that note, have a wonderful evening. Thank you for watching. Have a good week, and we see you next week. Good night.
Thank you.